We all know how an assassin story begins, right? It's that one single act that completely changes the course of history. But what about how it ends? Today, we're going to dig into something you might not have thought about: the assassin's afterlife. We tend to focus on the crime itself, the chaos, the victim. But from a historian's point of view, what happens after that shot is fired can be just as consequential. The fate of the assassin, well, that can send ripples through history in some really powerful and unexpected ways. So we're going to explore how the way an assassin dies, whether it's a public spectacle, a state-controlled secret, or even a self-inflicted act of martyrdom, becomes its own political statement. Let's see how these final moments end up shaping legacies and, maybe more importantly, revealing what a society is most afraid of. Okay, here's our roadmap. We're going to start with a mystery that honestly still haunts America today. Then we'll look at the extreme, and I mean extreme lengths governments will go to control the story. We'll also see how some assassins manage to achieve this kind of twisted immortality. And finally, we'll tie it all together to see what these stories really tell us about power, fear, and memory. So let's begin with probably the most famous example of an assassin who never ever got to tell his side of the story, leaving this huge void that's been filled with suspicion for, over 60 years now? I mean, look at this timeline. It is astonishingly short. Just 2 days after President Kennedy was assassinated, Lee Harvey Oswald's story comes to this incredibly sudden and violent end. He's being transferred from jail, and bam, a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby just lunges out of a crowd of reporters and shoots him. And the craziest part? It was all live on national television. The entire country watched, completely stunned, as the man accused of this monumental crime was murdered right before their eyes. You see, Oswald's death didn't bring any closure. It basically shattered any hope of getting it. With him gone, there was no trial, no testimony, nothing. His public murder created this total vacuum of information, a black hole right at the center of the story. And you know what rushes into a vacuum? Questions, doubts, and in this case, decades of competing conspiracy theories. His silence, enforced by a bullet, meant the official story could never really stick, leaving this permanent, unsettling question mark at the heart of a massive national trauma. So while Oswald's death created this narrative that just spiraled out of control, other governments have gone to incredible lengths to make sure that never happens. Now we're going to look at cases where the state took absolute control, determined to completely erase the assassin from history and stop any kind of posthumous worship in its tracks. So here we have two really extreme methods of state control, but both are born from the exact same fear. The fear that an assassin's grave could become a sacred site, a shrine for their cause. On the one hand, you have a secret burial. On the other, well, you have the complete and utter obliteration of the body. Both tactics were designed to send the same chilling message: the state gets the final word. Period. So, 12 days after killing Abraham Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth is cornered in a tobacco barn. He's shot through the neck, paralyzed, and he supposedly looks down at his hands, the hands that pulled the trigger, and just utters these final words. But for the government, his death wasn't the end of the story. They were terrified that Southern sympathizers would turn his grave into some kind of Confederate memorial, so they secretly buried his body under a prison floor, denying it to his family for years. But the state's response to Leon Czolgosz, the man who assassinated President McKinley, it was on another level entirely. After they executed him, officials were so afraid his grave would become a pilgrimage site for anarchists that they refused to release the body. Instead, they put his corpse in a coffin, poured concentrated sulfuric acid all over it, and then just waited 12 hours for it to dissolve. It was a clear, brutal message that not a single trace, not a bone, not a button would be allowed to exist. Okay, but what happens when the assassin or their movement actually manages to control the narrative of their own death? In those cases, death isn't an ending at all. It's the beginning of a powerful and sometimes very enduring legacy. Take Gavrilo Princip, the man whose assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand kicked off World War I. He died a pretty miserable death from tuberculosis in an Austrian prison. His captors buried him in an unmarked grave, hoping he'd just be forgotten. But after the war, his homeland, now part of Yugoslavia, dug up his remains and reburied him as a national hero. His death in custody was completely reframed as a sacrifice, transforming him from a terrorist into a powerful symbol of freedom. Now, this is incredible. In 1960, a 17-year-old kid named Otoya Yamaguchi assassinated Japan's Socialist Party leader on live television. 3 weeks later, in his jail cell, he mixed toothpaste and water to write this message on his wall, invoking an old samurai tradition, and then he hanged himself. By taking his own life and leaving this final, defiant note, Yamaguchi deliberately made himself a martyr for Japan's far right, creating a legacy that for ultranationalists endures to this day. And this might be the most calculated attempt to shape a legacy from beyond the grave. After assassinating Mahatma Gandhi, Nathuram Godse used his trial as a political platform. But his most strategic move, his real masterstroke, was his final request, that his ashes not be scattered but preserved until India and Pakistan were reunited. For over 70 years, those ashes have been kept, just waiting. They've become this potent symbol for his Hindu nationalist cause, ensuring his ideology would live on long after his execution. Okay, so let's tie all these different threads together. What does this all really tell us about the power that's held in an assassin's final moments, and even in their physical remains? This table just lays it all out so clearly, doesn't it? It all comes down to who controlled that final chapter. Oswald's public murder left a void of pure uncertainty. The state tried to create a void of memory for Booth and Czolgosz by hitting the delete button. But then you have Princip and Godse, where, through their supporters or their own careful planning, they filled that void with a powerful, lasting story of their own. You know, in the end, these stories tell us a lot more about the societies they rocked than they do about the assassins themselves. Whether a body is dissolved in acid, secretly buried, or reburied as a hero, that act becomes a mirror. It reflects a nation's deepest anxieties about its own stability, its ideological fractures, and just how far the state is willing to go to control not just the present, but history itself. And that leaves us with this one last, really provocative question. When you try to erase an assassin from history, does it actually silence their cause? Or does it risk creating an even more powerful myth that just festers in the shadows? It's a question that shows us how the story of an assassination, and all the politics that surround it, really, truly never ends.